All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. We're gonna jump into the second session for this second day of APIAHiP National Forum. So let's welcome new leaders in historic spaces, united approaches in reclaiming Denver's forgotten Chinatown. And first, we'll have Joie Ha, Executive Director of Colorado Asian Pacific United, followed by Molly Rose Merkert, Research Assistant, University of Colorado Denver's Dana Crawford Historic Preservation Program. And finally, Madison Lee and Jacob Joie with Rocky Mountain A.A.P.I Student Coalition. And so if you please welcome them to get started.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. Thanks so much to my amazing co-panelists and APIAHiP for having us. We're excited to talk to you today a bit about Denver's forgotten Chinatown. I am curious if anyone here has heard anything about Denver's Chinatown. If you could raise your hand if you've ever heard of it at all. Okay, that's more than I expected, but I mean, I guess that makes sense given the conference that we're at. So we're going to talk a bit more about that Chinatown, about our united approaches and the work that's going on in Colorado that is very specific about preserving and elevating our unknown histories. Oops. Oh, my slide's been advanced. Okay. So we usually start our work with a land acknowledgement. I'm not going to go through this in its entirety, but in the land that we work on, it's Arapaho, Ute, and Cheyenne are the main ancestral homelands. And then currently right now we are in the Coast Salish indigenous lands. It's important for us to recognize that none of our stories exist in a silo, and that when we are talking about our marginalized communities' histories, that it's important for us to really understand that a lot of us are here as settlers as well, and that we must pay homage to that. So I'm from the organization called Colorado Asian Pacific United. We take a very holistic approach towards elevating little-known Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander histories in Colorado. I think a lot of folks, their perception of Colorado very much is that it's a very white state, and in a lot of ways, yes, that's true. But like with a lot of our history in the larger United States, there has been Asian Americans in the area since the very founding. In fact, we were very integral in the founding of the economic backbone of our state, as is with our country. So what we do is to make sure that people understand that. I'm gonna go through a bit of our sort of theoretical conceptual background, and I'm gonna go through it relatively quickly because I think we'll all be on the same page. But in short, this is something that we really live by, or we consider, is there's African proverb which says, "Until the lion tells the story, the hunter will always be the hero." And then so the question that we are constantly, and I think all of us are constantly asking, is whose narrative matters in the grander scheme of what we consider to be history? Who decides what is history? How is history passed on? And are certain methods valued over others? Whose narrative matters most? And is there such thing as objectivity when it comes to this work? And then lastly, how do we perceive history in the passage of time? So how do we view history? Usually we trust history museums, we trust textbooks and written texts, we trust academic scholars. I'm sure all of you are familiar with having to write an essay, and then in that essay, your teacher being, well, okay, what are your sources? Can you cite your sources? Is this article peer-reviewed? Where did you get this from, right? This very, very distinctive way, this Western way of how we consider what's a reliable source of knowledge. And additionally, in Western society, history is often viewed as stagnant and set in stone, something that's a remnant in the past that is unchangeable. So that leads to a lot of suppressed and erased narratives, right? So if history institutions historically have been used as tools to uphold things like colonialism and imperialism, that means that narratives that don't support that are inevitably erased or suppressed. And our understandings of history then are decided by those in power and are also extractive in nature. How many of us have had people or researchers come to our communities to get surveys, right? Oh, we want to know what your community thinks about this particular thing. And then when do you actually hear from them again, right? And then oral histories and other ways of knowing are lost or seen as less than. And then overall, history in the context that we live in is often relegated to the past. But in our cultures and in our families, we understand that history is just as present today. It's something that you interact with every single day, right? It's something that directly impacts how you view who you are, and that directly is the blueprint of the future that you are making. And then so understanding that context really sets the foundation for the work that we're doing with Denver's Chinatown. And so I'm going to switch over and give you actually a brief history of Denver's Chinatown, since this is truly a forgotten, erased narrative, both locally and nationally. So basically, in the late 1800s, Denver had a thriving Chinatown. This was actually the largest Chinatown in the interior West. It's very similar to a lot of Chinatowns that you still might see, of course, in San Francisco and New York City. It had all of the makings of a ethnic enclave. It had businesses, it had a lot of laundromats, a lot of restaurants, and people lived there. And it specifically was a hub because nearby in Utah, I'm sure again, as you understand, the Transcontinental Railroad had been finished. It met in Utah at Promontory Peak, and then people there had nowhere to go. And so a lot of them came to Denver. And so a lot of migrants, they ended up there, and it served as this ethnic enclave for quite some time. There was a anti-Chinese race riot in Denver in 1880. And it was actually cited in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 as a reason for why Chinese immigrants shouldn't come anymore. And because of that racist federal legislation, a xenophobic society, the Denver Chinatown disappeared, and there is no clear evidence of its existence today. So if you actually walk through downtown Denver, which is where the Chinatown was located, you cannot see any longstanding architecture or businesses that can give you an indication that this used to be a cultural ethnic enclave. And then so even this information was not widely known by the Asian American community in Colorado. So this information for quite some time has been incredibly suppressed. And so that's sort of the setting the context of which we started doing our work. When we started our work around 2020, again, there was no evidence, right, of Denver's Chinatown. However, there was one plaque that was on the outskirts of the Chinatown that described a little bit about the information, and it described the Chinatown as Hop Alley and the things that happened in that time as a Chinese riot. So if you did not know the history, you might have assumed that the riot was started by Chinese people when it really was not. The riot was very similar to a lot of riots that you might have seen in the West Coast in the driving out period. So the plaque itself, though well-intentioned when it was put up, gave a really poor picture of what was going on. And in the actual body of the text, talked briefly about the riot and mostly focused on the white folks that were helpful to Chinese people at the time. So again, not necessarily something that is focused on or centered on the Chinese narrative. Oh, I'm going to go back. I'm going to talk about the riot a little bit. I realize there's no slide about the riot. So the riot actually had started on October 31st in 1880 in a pool hall where some white men started getting in an altercation with some of the Chinese men playing pool. It spilled out into the alleyway, and then in a couple hours, there were thousands of Denverites that descended upon the Chinatown. They had burnt everything down. They brutalized the residents, and then they dragged out a young man and lynched him, and his name was Luke Young. And again, this history is something that Colorado for the longest time did not acknowledge, and even our Chinese community in Colorado did not know. So this context is what brings us to our work in 2020 when we started talking about, can we remove this plaque? Because this plaque doesn't actually tell the real story about the riot. And also no one knows about the Chinatown. So we really started questioning, what can we do? It took us 2 years of advocacy to finally get this plaque removed, but we became happy to announce that it was removed in 2022. And then you might be wondering, okay, well, what else did you do other than remove the plaque? And so I'm happy to share that with you. A lot of our work is based in understanding that the community should always be first. So we work very closely with the 2 historic families that are still remaining in Colorado today that have ties to the Chinatown. we understand there may be more families that might have connections, but as we know, the two families that have stayed in the Colorado region are the Lung and Chin families. So one of our proudest accomplishments is that in 2022, we were able to secure an apology from Mayor Michael B. Hancock that made an apology to the Chinese immigrants and their descendants, specifically about the way the anti-Chinese race riot was handled and the general mistreatment of the Chinese community. And we were the first city to do so outside of California, the fifth in the nation. And in California, the majority of most of the cities that had issued the apologies had maybe a Asian American population of around 10% or more. In Denver, our population is around 4%. So this was definitely something that we we're incredibly excited about. And I also want to mention that, apology just alone in itself can be very performative. But what was most exciting about this was that the Lung and Chin families were actually present to receive the apology. And the Lung and Chin families were there to receive the apology, the proclamation, and the acknowledgement from the mayor. In addition to that, we have also collaborated with the city on a documentary called Reclaiming Denver's Chinatown. It's 50 minutes and it features the Lung and Chin families. They're pictured here. Would highly recommend it. It's free on YouTube. It's a good watch. So just put that in the YouTube and you'll be able to find it. Other things that we have done is that we have installed 3 historical markers and 2 murals in strategic locations important to the Chinatown as a way to physically and metaphorically reclaim space. Really to show people that where you're standing at, where you're walking through is historically the Chinatown. So you have this map here where it shows some of the locations of our historical markers. This is a mock-up of what the markers look like. This is the design. And a lot of our work is, again, I had mentioned this, very holistic. It's very multimodal. So, which means that we don't only come at our work through a historian perspective. And a lot of the folks that we work with are architects, they're designers, they're artists, they're oral historians, they're community leaders, business owners, restaurant owners, and the such. And so, yeah, our architect board member designed those. And then, so when we finally finished the installation, we had a block party. So on the left-hand side is what the marker actually looks like. And that's what it looks like installed. And then on the right-hand side is one of our murals that we put up. And the mural is called Be Not Afraid of Going Slow, of Not Going at All. It was done by a Hmong American artist locally, Nolly Lore. It's actually her first mural that she put up. And I think she did a phenomenal job. And these are just pictures of that celebration that we had. I do want to note an interesting development too is, so you might see the marker on the left there. That's the one on 1620 Wazee Street. We had another one that was on, again, really heart of downtown Denver. A few months after it was installed, it went missing. It was ripped from its base. It's not something that you can easily do by hand. It's incredibly heavy. You can see the concrete foundation right there. And we couldn't find it. We don't know exactly how it happened. Even if it was an accident, the question is where's the marker itself? But just a few weeks ago, we reinstalled it again. Really resolute in our journey to say that, we've been erased before, but we're gonna be back again. So yay, exciting development I wanted to share with y'all. Here's another one of our murals. It's called Woven on the Wind. This one was done by Corey Fetter, who's a Korean American artist. What's a bit different about this mural is that it shows a bit larger of the Pan-Asian diaspora and really honoring that journey alongside the Chinese American journey. And so she specifically used things like Korean textile design within her particular piece to indicate her own heritage. And in general, our methodology is really centering our community. We really go by the statement, nothing about us without us, right? Even as an organization that's deeply embedded in the community, we know that we can't speak for everyone. So in every single thing that we do, we make sure that the people that are most impacted are the ones that make the decisions. We don't think that you deserve just to be at the table and have a voice. We deserve that you should be making the decisions. And then we also really have our strategies are very much about inside and outside methods. Like I had mentioned earlier before, and as I'm sure all of you understand, our historical institutions were not built for people like us. And that means that even if we interact and work with historical institutions today, those structures, again, were not made for us. So we do two methods, and that one, we work within institutions to continue to push them and push them to include our erased and suppressed narratives. But understanding that these were never built for us, we work outside of institutions. How do we create our own spaces for unfiltered and community-led stories? There must be both in our methodology. There must be both. Current initiatives that we're working on, we are in the process of doing a historical survey of the area that used to be the Chinatown. That means that we will be able to finally say with definitiveness that this building used to be a laundromat, or this building used to be the apartment buildings that house these families. Because right now, there are very few records available. So there is a really there is a timeline that we're working with, right? We want to make sure that we are able to get this information before more of it and more of it is unfindable. We are doing some more art installations in the alleyway that used to be the historic heart of Chinatown. We're doing some designs on some traffic bollards. In the future, we want to look at doing some overhead lighting, of making it more of a pedestrian walkway, something that is a place that people can go and spend time. We are working on K-12 Chinatown curriculum development. We're actually launching our 4th grade social studies lessons plans next week, in 2 weeks. And we're going to be piloting with them with a few teachers. And then excitingly, I'm really excited to share that we will be having a Chinatown exhibit with our history museum, History Colorado, that's opening on October 9th in 2024, and it'll be up for a year. And Molly Rose will talk a bit more about that too. But what's really exciting about this, and I do want to share this brief anecdote, is that one of the historic families have been for years collecting information about their family's history. And at a time, I don't remember exactly when, but definitely before we started working with the History Museum, they had decided they wanted to donate their artifacts and their family heirlooms to the museum. And the museum had told them no. They didn't have room for it, and they weren't interested. And then so when we are partnering with institutions, we hold these truths while we work with them, and we consistently advocate for our communities. And I'm really excited to say that we are really enjoying our collaboration with the History Museum, and they have been incredibly helpful in the sense that I push back often in a lot of our work. And on the committee that is planning the exhibit are the historic families. So it's been sort of this full circle story where historically, the families were not involved, right? And in fact, when they went and tried to offer the history, they were told that their histories weren't important. And now we have come to the point where not only are they involved, but they are the ones making the decisions about the exhibit. They are the ones sourcing the artifacts for the exhibit. We have a recreated interior space, and they are the ones that are deciding what that space looks like. And then so that's some of the things that we're really excited about with our work. So some future goals that we have a alleyway that I mentioned was a heart of Denver's Chinatown. We're looking to reactivate. So we want to make sure it's pedestrian friendly. We want to put lots of art in it, invite small businesses to come in and create spaces for people to be in. This mock-up was made from the architect on our team. And then we also, this has been exciting work for us. We are planning to open the first Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander Culture and History Museum in the Rocky Mountain region. So this is just our work with, I talked a lot about our work with the Chinatown, but we do still have a lot of other work with other communities that we are continuing to do. And all of it will culminate into something like this. So we're excited to share that as well. And that's it for my portion of the presentation. I'm going to hand it over to Molly Rose. And at the end, we'll be taking questions about all of our work together.
I'm going to be speaking about the university's role in this work that we've been doing. I go to UC Denver, the University of Colorado, Denver. But before I do that, a little about me. I'm Molly Rose Merkert. I have been a Master's of Science in Historic Preservation candidate since 2023, a Master's of Architecture candidate since 2020. That's really just bureaucracy. In 2008, I moved to Colorado, and in 1999, I moved to the US from China. So the University of Colorado Denver has interacted with this research on Denver's Chinatown at about 3 levels: internal education, technical practice, and public collaboration. So this first level is internal education. We've held classes about Denver's Chinatown. In the fall semester of 2023, there was a class called The Suppressed Interior. It was an undergraduate class held by the College of Architecture and Planning. Layuan Lee, my boss, was the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion visiting professor. He's been hired now. There were 11 students, a TA, and then later me in a specialized capacity. This is a picture of their final exhibit. And what the students did was they took a block of historic Chinatown. If you know Denver, this is between Wazee, Blake, 15th and 16th. And they designed several community spaces for it. Pretty picture of the model. They designed a museum in this area, a dining hall over here, a health center, and student and worker housing. This model is quite large. It's about 6 feet by 6 feet. The class also created a book about the history of Denver's Chinatown. I'll be passing this around. Please give it back to me. It was an extremely limited print, and I cannot get another. The students were not focusing on design guidelines, but they ended up following quite a few of them. These additions are non-invasive and notably in a different style than the original buildings. I'm now going to pick on my professor because she's here. Chris Geddes, do you think this would pass design review? Yes, no, maybe with review, or maybe with alteration? For me, it was really important to see a project, a studio school-sponsored project, work with reuse, adaptive reuse. It's not something I saw in my studios about 2 years ago, but I am hopeful that this idea is starting to percolate into the architecture world. Recently, a winner of the Pritzker Prize, that's basically Nobel Prize for architecture, was given to a pair who have never demolished a building. Their final presentation for this exhibit was held in one of the most prominent spaces in the school. They presented to each other and members of the public. And when they did their presentations around this very long table with food to mimic a family meal. Their exhibit found an even more public venue until a few weeks ago. This space is at the corner of Larimer and 14th, so anyone passing by the school could see it, and you'll find out why it moved a few weeks ago in part 3. Part 2 is technical practice for students. These are community projects that end up impacting the community. So the Colorado SHPO is trying for 150 registered nominations or amendments that focus on minority history by the 150th state anniversary or statehood anniversary. That's 2026. As a final assignment, one of our professors, Kathy Corbett, had her students start amendments that would fulfill these requirements. One of her students, Todd Maciszewicz, was working on Central Presbyterian Church. And after the semester was over, he asked me to join him in working on it, because my entire cohort knows that if you're working on Chinatown, come visit me. And then Damien Pechota was our connection at the Colorado SHPO, and he was instrumental in getting this done. This is Central Presbyterian Church. It's at 1600 Sherman Street. It was built in 1892, had an American Historic Building Survey done in 1969, was added to the National Register in 74 under architectural significance because it's perfect Romanesque, Richardsonian Romanesque architecture. The church has a long history of serving the community. The basement is currently an unhoused shelter, but originally it was a Chinese school. This school provided English lessons and Bible study for railroad workers and miners. It started in 1877 in a different building, but as soon as this building was built, the school went there. The common attendance was around 60 to 70 people. It has a bit of women's history too. As long as the school was in this building, so from 1872 to 1919, it was administered by Helen Webster. And the church was known to very publicly defend the community and speak out against laws at all levels that were persecuting the Chinese community. This was about one of 3 schools in the city, but this is the only one that we know remains, and we know the location of. We also created a list of 78 members using members of the school, using adult baptisms, member lists, dismissals, newspaper articles, and magazines. One of my favorite parts of this entire process was going to Central Presbyterian and going through their documents. These are all session minutes that regard the school, and this last one is from March of 1892, mentioning how their reserve lists were getting so large because members of the Chinese community were leaving the country. The original National Register nomination is about 6 pages. Our amendment, which adds criterion A, significant events, is approximately 50 pages, and it was approved by National in August. I just got my letter. Now, level 3 is public collaboration. This is where I talk about the upcoming exhibit. We are one of the collaborators for the Denver's Chinatown exhibit at History Colorado. Before I talk about exactly what the university has been doing, I want to say that the SHPO, History Colorado, has been an amazing vehicle for collaboration. Decisions have been extremely community driven, and History Colorado has always been open to discussion. This is a picture of our most recent meeting with Sam over here and Josie from History Colorado. There is Linda Lung from the Lung family, so one of Denver's descendant families. There's Dr. Wei, who's our state historian. And you might notice that Josie is holding a small device that has her camera. And I think, Joey, you were on this meeting via the camera. Joey and Heather, another member of the Lung family. And I think Jasmine was there too via just really, they do everything they can to make sure that everyone is at the table and can give feedback. The Lung family has also been amazing. Here are some of their family photos that they're sharing for the exhibit. It's amazing to see these photos. I love them. And also some of the artifacts that they're planning on letting us show. Speaking of, we recently at our last meeting were talking about how to display these without letting them be damaged, but also without having everyone have to just look at plastic bags. So UC Denver is, of course, loaning objects from the suppressed interior class. We're loaning pictures and the model under the idea of this is what we can imagine Denver's Chinatown looking like in the future. And then we're also working on the actual architecture of the exhibit because we are an architecture school. So when History Colorado came to us, they said that they really wanted to spotlight the interior space. This center section where we will have the recreate interior. And so one of the things we're doing here with these 3 different squares is talking about how these are all kind of the same space, at least architecturally. We're drawing a link between this historic model from about the 1890s, this center section, which is going to be the recreated interior, which we're not. I don't think we have a very defined for that. And then this future model, which is the loan. This is a slightly old picture, so the door is actually in the center now, but there's this view that you can see through kind of history, very briefly. Another thing that we're doing is the graphic design of the model. You might recognize, this name in the corner, that's kind of covered, Trevor Motzko. He was part of the suppressed interior class. And he created this image for the to press interior class, and the exhibit team loved it, so it's been turned into the poster, and Trevor Motzko's come back to do this. And also our titles. The idea with these is this corner section here, which is to represent kind of turning a page in a book, or also, this is a complete book reader sin, but dog earing the page to show how important this history is. And then finally, the part that I worked very much on is how do you make a model of a pretty much undocumented site? The museum wants to show a historical model of the area, but we don't have a lot of pictures showing the architecture. They didn't get HAB's documentation, and a lot of the area has been remodeled. So what we did was we started with what we knew, a Sanborn map. Yep. And then one of the most fascinating things for me was this section up here, which is just labeled Chinese gambling company, but has a high number of dwellings, possibly the highest number in the 4 blocks that we modeled, which means that I think a lot of our community lived there. And so then what we did was we went through, for a very long time, Denver Public Library images, and we found any buildings that we could from the time and modeled those out. We also have this corner up here, which is still standing, which we were able to just go and look at and model out. And then we used the Sanborn map for the footprints and relative heights of the other spaces. And then on top of this, we're going to have a discussion within the museum and attendee participation about why don't we know more about this area and what do we think this area might have looked like at the time. And so here's an approximate image of what our exhibit will look like. It's slightly been edited since then, but what I had when I had to turn in my materials. And so thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jacob Joie. I am a senior piano major at Denver School of the Arts. And Maddie.
Hi, I'm Maddie Lee. I'm also a senior at Denver School of the Arts, and I'm a visual arts major. Jake and I are both from Colorado. We're both heavily involved with this amazing organization called Rocky Mountain A.P.I Student Coalition. And we decided to start this last year because we noticed a lack of greater community between A.P.I youth in Colorado. And now we lead initiatives to help foster that kind of community through events, volunteering, social media, and supporting school clubs and activities. So just some more information about who we are. So Jake and I are representatives of the Rocky Mountain A.P.I Student Coalition, like mentioned before, which is a group of Asian American Pacific Islander teenagers living in the Rocky Mountain area, focused on empowering Asian American youth identities. Our goal is to provide passionate A.P.I teens with the resources and opportunities to become future leaders. And RMASC works to uplift the voices of marginalized A.P.I youth. And as a part of RMASC's youth organizing team, students get the opportunity to lead campaigns that fall under 4 central issues, which are breaking stigmas in the A.P.I community, A.P.I immigrant rights and policy, economic justice in A.P.I communities, and preservation of A.P.I history, arts, and culture. This project is rooted in the celebration of A.P.I youth changemakers across the country, and we are so grateful for this opportunity to expand our endeavors aimed at uplifting the voices of RMASC leaders.
So we were driven to create this coalition due to, like we said before, like kind of an absence just in general of the Asian community in Colorado, especially looking at a lack of history and heritage. And so kind of just the basics being that there is almost no knowledge of our history in the region, especially looking at Denver's Lost Chinatown, which I actually did not know existed until about a month ago. And also just personally, RMASC is a way for me to really connect with my heritage, speaking as a 2nd-generation immigrant, and it's really important that we bring that opportunity to others like me and the larger AAPI community. So RMASC is a completely student-run organization where teens ages 14 through 18 have opportunities to lead campaigns that center around their interests. And we have worked with community leaders from Asian Girls Ignite, Filipino American Community Colorado, and Colorado Asian Pacific United, to name a few, which help the students participate in these activities. And one of these campaigns is our historical, artistic, and cultural preservation branch, where a main focus of ours is looking at reclaiming Denver's Chinatown and bringing this education into K through 12 classrooms, which brings me on to the next slide. RMASC is also working to develop lesson plans, infographic posters, and informative speaker days that cover meaningful historical happenings in our community that are often left untold, and to bring a more inclusive A.A.P.I. history into Colorado social studies curriculum. As Joie kind of had on her slides before, they are working on K through 12 education programs, and we're looking forward to working with them and forwarding that initiative. And so, like a little thing, having physical cultural ties to the land near where you live is super important in connecting with one's heritage and identity. And you know, we hope to bring that sense of connection back to the rest of
So these are some photos from our Denver School of Arts chapter, which is our school, and our East High School chapter, and at some of the events that we have held to promote that same kind of like cultural and historic preservation that we've been talking about, and also celebrating heritage in general. Specifically, these are pictures from our Lunar New Year celebrations last February, where we shared a lot of historic Chinese customs and traditions with new and old members of all of our different chapters. Okay, so yeah, we would like to emphasize the importance of engaging younger generations in preservation efforts. This is because getting youth involved in history work helps to sustain and revive cultural identities that might otherwise be lost. It fosters a sense of belonging within the community, which is something that we are continuously seeking out, as we are finding more and more students feel culturally isolated, especially with the increasing pressures of assimilation in like the modern era. So this ensures that the stories that are historically important to the experiences of so many generations before us are really not forgotten with the generations that come after. And when young people are involved in preservation, I can speak for like so many API kids when I say that it really does help us gain a deeper understanding of our heritage, which empowers us. And obviously that aligns with RMASC's mission to uplift API youth identities and leadership. And on that note, we'd also like to point out the importance of creating a continuous narrative, which basically just means referring to unique approaches that ensure that the history of not only Denver's lost Chinatown, but also like thousands of other significant cultural sites across the country are not just snapshots in time, but rather like a continuous narrative that evolves as it's passed down from generation to generation. And this continuity is really key to building a resilient and informed community for the future.
Thank you very much for having us. And we'll pass it back to Joie for questions.
All right, so we are going to open it up for questions. We did want to do a bit more of like a panel format. So we do have a good amount of time. And so if you wanted to think about a question and pose it, you definitely can. But we'll go ahead and open it up, and let's see, I will come to you, or we will come to you if you would like to introduce yourself and yeah, ask your question.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I think it's safe to say that you are all doing amazing work, and I can speak for everyone in this room when I'm impressed. And I hope that all of our community, from young people who are working in this vein and doing similar projects. But for many of us in this room, for years, we've been relying on a tradition of doing youth programming for like young kids ages like 8 to 10 to be where we actually reach them. And we see less engagement as those kids go into teenagers who haven't engaged with us in years. And I would love to learn and see if you would each be interested in sharing your thoughts on how we can give more experiences for young people in our communities to be doing the kind of work you're doing in your communities. And if there's any particular thought you have on maybe how you got connected with this kind of path, or how you think we could do better in helping that happen with young people in our own communities, I would be interested to hear that too. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I feel like kind of on like that note of like what the question was about. I don't know if I'm going to be answering this correctly, but I'm going to try. I think we've had a lot of success kind of just like reaching out and bugging like a lot of different like clubs in our area, because like I mean a lot of clubs in our in like the Denver region have like A.A.P.I. like affinity groups and stuff, but they're not always like they don't always know that there's a greater organization that can help them do these things. I think for me and Jake, we've run like our school's A.A.P.I. club, and like we've like come across a lot of challenges with kind of getting kids engaged. It's like the same thing. And I think like just knowing that there's like something bigger that's like helping you, and like I feel like that's just a motivating factor for a lot of kids. I mean, it's hard working with teenagers like this period, but it helps. Also just like social media too. So get on TikTok.
This relates a bit to what I was talking about, inside and outside methods, right? The way that our academic system is set up is in a way where ethnic histories and cultures are only taught in like certain grades or in certain sections. So there is, of course, advocacy that must be done within the system. And then so something that we helped with a few years ago is when we had a new social studies standards curriculum that folks were putting out at the state level. The red line version, so the edited version, had crossed out mentions of Asian Americans specifically, and also the model minority myth. So we actually did a bit of advocacy and had people go for public comment and tell them that this needed to be included. So there's work that needs to be done to change the system, and there's also work to be done outside of it, right? What avenues of education are available, what avenues of engagement are available for folks outside of the formal educational institutions, and what can that look like? And then what can it look like when youth are engaged in being in charge of their own learning? So some things that I've seen that have been really successful for engaging some of the youth is that like I mentioned that we're going to be designing some of the traffic bollards that are in the historic Chinatown. So the artists that were hired or that we're contracting with, Jasmine Chu, is actually going to be doing something with Asian Girls Ignite, which is a local nonprofit in Colorado that works with middle school to high school aged girls and non-binary youth. And they're going to be co-designing it. So they're doing it together. Another thing that we've noticed too is when we did, this is not in relation to the Chinatown, but we have a Little Saigon initiative, and we've been gathering oral histories from our communities. And we directly hire from the community for folks who are actually going to be the ones gathering the stories. And so some of the folks that we had come in and be those folks that asked the questions and recorded it were youth. And so I think the question is like, how can we look at education in a way where it's collaborative and there's a lot of co-learning in it, right? How can the youth see themselves in what they're learning, and how can they be directing their own learnings, as opposed to this very traditional Western format? It's like, I tell you what you need to know. Is how can we come on this learning journey together and uncovering these histories, again, that very much don't exist in our textbooks. So they are the historians in that way. They are the ones that are learning. They are the ones that are uncovering and elevating it to the general public, which, with it comes with a lot of empowerment and feeling of, they're involved and they're excited. And so, yeah, that would be my answer. Molly Rose, do you have anything?
Okay, so I don't work with youth, but from my own personal experience, those seeds that you plant in like 4th grade can bloom many, many years later. I was that teenager who just did not care about my heritage, then had an identity crisis in my early 20s, and here I am now.
Hi, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. It's amazing and it's inspiring. My question is about the connection between reclaiming histories, reclaiming erased stories, and reclaiming space. So you mentioned that, right? That this erased Chinatown. If you go there, like you wouldn't be able to see anything that would tell you that this is Chinatown. But now you're right, reclaiming it inch by inch almost. And I'm curious, is there an implication? Because, right, I think not most, but a significant portion of Denver regionally, the Asian American population is not in Denver proper. So I'm curious whether you live in Denver proper or if you live outside of Denver, but that's another question. It's really about, as you're reclaiming this physical space, are you seeing it attract more attention from Asian American communities and individuals across the region? And is there that interplay then also between what you're doing in Chinatown, in Denver itself, as well as maybe a more increased awareness and attention towards spaces that are not in Denver itself, but in the suburbs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's something that actually, so people will come up to us and ask, and it's like, oh, are you going to start the Chinatown again type of thing? And our answer is like, no, not really, right? There are existing ethnic enclaves in Denver and in the surrounding Denver metro areas that have these strong Asian American populations. And a lot of what we're doing in the reclamation of space is to make sure that the Asian perspective and narrative is shown in these general public areas, but it's not necessarily to force something like an ethnic enclave, because those form really organically, right? And so those conversations are really interesting too, because when we're talking about finding a space for our museum, those are the same types of questions that we ask. Do we want to have the museum in a place that is historically relevant, that was like a particular building of importance for the Chinese community? Or do we want to have it in a place where there is a large Asian American Pacific Islander population? So there's pros and cons, of course, to both, right? If we're doing it in the historical location, then yeah, there's this continuity of like, this is a reclamation of our space. But then also knowing our elders, who's going to parallel park downtown to come and see it? Not a lot of them, right? I mean, I barely like parallel parking downtown myself. So, those are questions that we contend with really often in saying, yes, we need this reclamation of space, but we must also support the existing spaces that we do have and that are at threat of gentrification. So a lot of things that, are going on here locally in Seattle with like the Little Saigon is actually very, very parallel to what's going on in Denver with Little Saigon. And so our work is really important for us to like balance these tensions, that yes, we want to make sure that the larger public, these very, very white spaces now, that there is our presence there, that you cannot erase that we were here, that we're still here. But we also want to make sure that that doesn't take away from the important work of preserving existing spaces. Does that answer your question? Yeah, I mean, it's not like a clear, like, this is like the way, right? But it's a conversation. It's a discussion that we'll continually have with community to see really at the end of the day what makes the most sense. Because at the end of the day, if we're doing a community museum, we want the community to be able to have those decision-making powers on, where it should be and what it should be about and what should we be focusing on.
Great. Thank you so much for your work. It's really inspiring. My name is Dan Sakura. And while we're in Colorado, I just wanted to highlight incredible victory for the AA and HPI community with the passage in 2022 of legislation, bipartisan bill to authorize the APIAHiP National Historic Site. We're really grateful. I served as a consultant to the National Parks Conservation Association. And every year, the APIAHiP Alliance, and I believe they're here tomorrow, Bainbridge, will be talking about, the power of APIAHiP. And there's incredible connections between APIAHiP and the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site, which is just within very close proximity. But I wanted to talk about another project that I think is very relevant and share with the group, and that is last month, President Biden proclaimed the Springfield 1908 Race Riot National Monument, which tells a story of the race riot against Black community in Springfield, Illinois. And what a lot of people don't know is there were race riots against Asians, mostly Chinese, including Denver and West Coast. And one of the concepts that actually the Park Service put forward was called the architecture of erasure. And in a lot of these sites, people go to these places like Springfield, like Tulsa in Oklahoma, and they say, oh, there's nothing there. There's nothing left because there's a conceit that there's a big house or something that's left. And what the Park Service did and what the Springfield folks did is said the absence of things, of structures, is the resource. And so the absence has the integrity. So as you look at whether it's Chinatown or the race riot sites, it's the absence of, and there's a special resource study that Park Service put out that documents this. So I'd be happy to share that if anybody has any questions. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Chris. I just wanted to say thank you so much for the great series of presentations. And I think my question's a little bit more oriented towards Molly's presentation. So as a fellow preservationist and recent architecture grad and family archivist, I was really excited to see your efforts to curate and to bring together a story coming from a family's archive. And I was wondering, in the sort of multi-sensory experience, maybe what the role of oral histories, for example, could play in curating the physical material of a family archive.
Well, I mainly just see the lungs at the family meetings. That's at the board meetings. But I think that oral histories are extremely important. And I think one of the best ways we've really decided what to put into the museum is by talking to the lungs and seeing what was really special to them. And that's honestly one of my favorite parts of working in this exhibit is hearing them speak about what these objects and what these photos mean and who's in these photos and what these dresses mean to them and so forth.
Yeah, so we are doing an oral history project with the Little Saigon, and then something that I think might be relevant or helpful in this discussion is that understanding how people best receive information or understanding what is an authentic or genuine way of sharing stories and understanding that looks different for everyone. So we received around like 30 oral histories for our Little Saigon project, and very early on we knew that these are going to exist on a website on a SoundCloud list, and who is going to be listening to 30-minute, 40-minute oral histories? Probably not a lot of people. So a lot of our questions when we're working with the community is, how do you want to see your stories told? Like what makes sense to you? Like, yes, we absolutely want to collect these oral history, want to archive them, especially, for your families in the future. But we know that not a lot of folks that aren't archivists will like be listening to these. We know that you might not even listen to your own 45-minute oral history, which is fine. I understand. I also sometimes don't like to listen to myself talk and recordings. So, and so we polled everyone when we were doing that work. We did some community remembering workshops too and polled them. And a lot of them said they wanted a documentary. So we put out an RFP and we hired a local Vietnamese American filmmaker, and we're putting together a documentary. We're going to be looking at potentially doing like an additional exhibit or like portrait books, poetry, art, and just basically trying to find out multimodal approaches to telling stories that are accessible to a lot of other people, including, of course, the ones that told them. And so that's some of the, I think, to build on what Molly Rose said, is like, it's really just talking to people and say, how do you want your stories to be told? Like, what makes sense for you beyond just collecting them in this format? Did y'all want to add anything?
Hi, I'm Damian Pachota with History Colorado with the SHPO's office. And I just wanted to give a shout out to Joie, who was instrumental in helping us get the third. So when we started out this year, we only had 2 sites on the National Register in Colorado related to AAPI. Joie was instrumental in getting the third, which is the Far East Center in Little Saigon. And then we now have 7 sites on the register as of today, just added 5 in just these past few months. But Molly Rose's edition is very special because it's the first time that in Colorado that Chinese American story is included in Colorado's state and national register, as well as the first time somebody from the AAPI community actually wrote the amendment. So that's a huge addition as well. So my question for you, Joey, you mentioned that History Colorado hasn't necessarily been supportive in the past, and we're making movements. Obviously, the SHPO's office having only 2 sites, that's very embarrassing. So what barriers do you think exist from being able to do future work?
I think, looking at how things have changed since since historic families tried to share their history with the museum, I think some of the things that changed that have really helped is the staff. I think the people that we work with now really have this desire to work with our communities and actually listen and elevate what we're looking to do, as opposed to dictating what we should be doing. I think some barriers that are inevitable when working with institutions, there's bureaucracy. There is quite a bit of bureaucracy when it comes to a lot of this type of work that maybe communities aren't super familiar with, or in some ways can be can take control away from communities. So with Little Saigon, we're doing the Museum of Memory project with Yadira, and like that has been like amazing. And she has been very receptive to things that we've been asking for. And one of the main things that we ran into pretty quickly was the consent form. The consent form from History Colorado basically says that once something is donated, so the oral history is in this context, that it's irrevocable, that you can't take it back. And this exists within like the larger Western realm of archiving things, right? It's in the archives, right? You can't really change what's in the archives. But for us, that was like, oh, whoa, like we need to pause right here, because our communities, when it comes to gathering stories, gathering this information, this has historically been very extractive, right? And when you're saying that you can't take anything back anymore, that is a bit of like uncomfortable tension, where it's like, does that mean we no longer have control of our stories, right? Like what if I want to change something? What if I want to remove it? What if I no longer want that to be in the archive? And so the solution that we came up with was not it was made it more bureaucratic, but it was what we could do at the time. That we had 2 consent forms. One of them was that it was specifically between the person giving the oral history and CAPU, and saying that, we'll work with you in whatever ways that we can to change or amend your story. And then we had a second consent form where, after they reviewed their oral history, we made it very clear that this one was with the History Museum. And this means that you can't take it back. So review it. Let me know what you want to cut out. Did you say something funny about your wife? Like, we'll cut it out. It's fine. And then, and then now it's irrevocable, right? But even in that conversation with Yadira, like we've been talking about, like, what are some ways that like could change things potentially, right? Because families do that does happen, right? Families will be like, hey, my grandfather gave this like oral history, and we don't really want it to be public anymore. Like, can we take it out? So there are some ways that we can work around that. But I think some of this question is really like looking at the larger like institution and the conception of what Western history is. There's inevitably going to be things that we run up against. And the biggest thing that I've been really advocating for in a lot of ways is community decision-making power. And like, what does that really look like to have control of your own narrative, and what structures in place make it difficult for folks to say with definitively, like, this is still my story, and I can interact with it even after I've donated.
I guess I would say probably another, like, a very similar barrier to getting these stories out is that oftentimes, like I know in the case of my grandparents, it's really difficult and challenging sometimes for them to go through that again. And often they don't want to, like, sometimes it's just too much, and that can be, it's very private. And so putting that on display, especially like you said, without being able to ever maybe take it down in the future, can be intimidating and kind of just hard. And it's not, especially with, this idea of like history is changing and it's never stagnant. The stories we want to tell are sort of at odds with the system that we currently use. So, yeah.
I am Jeffrey with the Little Tokyo Historical Society. I'm curious, when was the sort of around exact year that Chinatown ceased to exist? And where did some of the Chinese people disperse to? And what are some news stories that you guys discovered about the Chinese, including what you've heard from the Qin or Lum families?
So Chinatown kind of officially got demolished in around 1940. They just razed a block of Chinatown. After that, quite a few people headed for Highlands, I believe. Yeah. And after that, according to most records, they kind of just dispersed into the general population. Now it's say Joie has a better pulse on where they are.
Yeah, I think to add a bit more context to the reason why, and then I'm sure this is actually very familiar to a lot of folks here. In the 1940s, there was this push for urban renewal, and a lot of, the Chinatown was considered blighted areas. And then so we see a lot of the Chinatown start to decline at that time. In the 1960s too, there was another round of urban renewal that really just pushed everyone out. And what I want to call attention to, and I think is really interesting, is that around that same time, we were next to sort of our version of Little Tokyo, or Sakura Square. And what was really interesting about what happened with Sakura Square and why it still exists today is because the community had come together and had bought out that block. And so Stacy in the back is doing a lot of the work with redeveloping Sakura Square. So if you're ever curious about that, I'd recommend talking to her. But yeah, I think like thinking about like the movement of the Chinese community, we see a lot of them moving into the suburbs and then outside of Colorado. We do actually, within the Asian American community, the Chinese community is one of the largest in Colorado, but most of them are recent immigrants. So they are not ones that have those ties to the historic Chinatown. I think some interesting stories that have come out, and then I think one that I really like is when so one of the Lung families, they had a Chinese lottery that everyone participated in the neighborhood, and it was of course it was like illegal, right? And so but they would have these little punch cards that the kids would on their bikes would ride around and like go up to like different people like outside of the community too, like to white folks, and be like, oh, do you want to like do the lottery? Like, we'll take it back. And then and so they would do all these things to like resource their family to make sure that they could survive, since in a lot of ways the economic structures didn't really allow Chinese folks to participate in the same ways. And I don't remember if it was the lottery or if it was the mahjong parlor, but sometimes they would get raided by police, and then they had one of their tai tai they would like move everything out and they would have their tai tai stay, and then the police would come and be like, oh, like what's going on here, and then she'd be like, oh, I don't speak English. So I think that's like a really cool story that emerged, right? That I think when we talk about stories, it really humanizes the community, and I think that's one of the ones that really stuck out to me.
Speaking out stories, and this one might be in the documentary, but for me, one of the really interesting stories was one of the family homes for these descendant families is located under second base. Yeah. Second base of Coors Field, which is, I think, the 5th oldest baseball field now in the US.
We also have someone from the city of Aurora, Colorado, to have also an answer to that diaspora.
I was going to say, Aurora is the most diverse city in the state of Colorado, and Aurora also has the largest Asian population. And as we set out to start to update our survey plan and be more inclusive with telling story, there's a long-standing tradition with the Asian community dating back to the 60s, and there are even some groups who've been there 50, 60 years. And so I think it would be interesting to partner with you on maybe some ways to do public outreach. And when you were talking about potential locations for the museum, I can see the conundrum of wanting to be in the physical space where Chinatown was, but yes, I agree with parallel parking. Downtown is a mess. And then I think of like Aurora being an ideal location, and we have the Asian Pacific Development Center that has been crucial to supporting immigrants for 50 years from Cambodia and Taiwan and, all throughout Southeast Asia. And so I would love to see if there's some things we can do together to support each other.
Hi, I'm just wondering for the museum exhibit, have you been able to get in touch with any of the families from the Promontory Summit photo? Folks know the Promontory Summit photo, right? This is the Corky Lee photo from 2014. Got the families together from the original Promontory Peak photo. Have you been, I'm just guessing some of those families might be in the Denver area or Colorado. There might be someone here who might be able to help get in touch with some of those families.
Yeah, I think we would definitely love to be in touch. We aren't actually, and with the Lung and Chin families, I'm not too sure too about their relationship with the railroad. You remember?
I know the Chins were really miners. They were really involved with the mining families. I don't know about the Lungs. I think they were mercantile. Yeah.
Yeah, so like to our like with the existing families that we have in Colorado today, I don't know if either of them have really strong ties to the railroad. But that is a sort of a consistent question that we have within in our work. Is like where did everyone go? And it's like we have a general idea of like where people like moved out, but when we started doing this work, we were putting the calls out continuously, like, oh, is your family connected to the Chinatown? Is your family connected to Chinatown? Reach out, reach out, reach out. And we haven't really heard from folks. So like if we could get in touch with some of those folks there and potentially draw back some more lineages that we can actually trace, that would be really wonderful. Thank you.
All right, let's give a round of applause to our panelists.